Evening. Thanks for coming. So yes, I actually was not always a biologist. I was fascinated by the previous talk because I started my career as a computer scientist working in artificial intelligence, and I have been following the progress that we just heard about with great interest over the past few years. But the application of artificial intelligence to health is something that fascinates me a great deal and that I feel will play a great role. But at the end of the day, we also need to understand and work with biological systems in the laboratory, actually the wet laboratory, in order to get real progress in this area. We can't just do it by analyzing data. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what people like me are doing in this space, what is going on in the laboratory right now that is leading to the point where we have true medical control over the process of aging. In other words, where we can maintain people in a state of genuine good health however long ago they were born. This is something that, as we all know, humanity has hoped for since the beginning of time, really, since the dawn of civilization. And we haven't done very well. We haven't made much progress. But eventually, every technological challenge does yield to human intellect and intervention. And, of course, medicine is just a branch of technology. This is going to happen too. So I'm going to persuade you, I hope, tonight, that we're going to get to that point in the foreseeable future, perhaps only in a couple of decades. This is the title I gave the talk, Making Aging So Healthy That We Won't Call It Aging Anymore. I got a little miscentered, I'm not quite sure why, but anyway. So I'm going to start out with a very simple question. Why is aging so difficult to bring under control? In other words, why have we made so much less progress against the ill health of old age than the progress that we've made against the diseases that we suffer early in life? You probably know that even in the world's wealthiest countries, more than 1/3 of babies, literally more than 1/3, would die before the age of 1. Even 150 years ago, not like 1,000 years ago, just 150 years. That's insane. You know, that just doesn't happen anymore in any industrialized country. And, of course, it's not just infant mortality. We're also talking about mortality in childbirth and so on. And we did this by really elementary means, by things like just figuring out that hygiene was a good idea, and mosquito nets, and really simple medicines like vaccines and antibiotics. And we've made far, far less progress against the diseases and disabilities of old age. So we have to ask the question, why? Now, most people would say that this is the answer. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. The point is that there is so much that goes wrong late in life, and it goes wrong all more or less the same time, that maybe it's just the complexity. Maybe it's just that there's so much happening, and all these things are happening and interacting with each other and exacerbating each other. Maybe, there's no chance. It's just too complex for medicine to cope with. Now, that is actually part of the answer, but it's not the main answer. The main answer is that we've been making a huge mistake in the way that we think about aging. And on this slide, I'm trying to describe that mistake. This slide is the answer that most people would give to the question, in what ways can we get sick? So in other words, this is a taxonomy of sickness. the way that most people would say it. Most people would say, well, right, there's column 1, that's infectious diseases. Then there's column 2, which is the inherited diseases that a small number of us get, congenital diseases. And then there's column 3, which is the big one, the one that dominates the problems of health in the industrialized world today. That's, of course, the chronic progressive diseases of old age. And then most people would say that there's this 4th category way out in the stratosphere that's completely different from all of these 3 types of disease. It's called aging itself, and it consists of these very, poorly defined things like frailty, or, sarcopenia, that's just the loss of muscle as we get older, or immunosenescence, that's the decline in function of the immune system. These are things that people think of as completely separate from disease. And it turns out that that's a big mistake. The way that what I've just said is this, that there's aging, that's the 4th column that I just showed you, and then there's the diseases of old age, which is the 3rd column. And people think that there's a massive distinction between the two. They think that aging is this kind of natural, universal thing, and the diseases of aging are not like that. They are, they happen to some people and not to other people, and they're curable. This is nonsense. It's completely wrong. Let me explain why. Aging is actually not really a phenomenon of biology. What do I mean by that? Well, take consciousness. Consciousness is an emergent phenomenon, right? It's something that cars and aeroplanes and so on don't have. Only humans, or at least only living organisms, have consciousness. It's some kind of thing that you need this huge complexity of living matter to have. But aging isn't like that. Aging of a living organism like you or me is actually just the same as aging of a car or an aeroplane. It's simply a fact of physics that any machine, any system with moving parts is going to do itself damage. It's going to accumulate damage as an intrinsic, inevitable consequence, a side effect of its normal operation. Now, of course, the human body doesn't really go downhill very much. It doesn't lose function until middle age or thereafter. And it's the same with machines like cars. Every machine is set up to tolerate a certain amount of damage, but only a certain amount, and eventually there's too much and things start to go downhill. So in biological terminology, we can say it this way. We can say that metabolism, which is the network of processes that keep us alive from one day to the next, creates damage. And it creates damage throughout life, starting even before we're born. And that damage is basically harmless for a long time because the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of it. But then eventually there's too much. In late life, we get the pathologies of old age. So what we have been doing is what I'm calling here geriatrics, geriatric medicine. That consists of attacking the pathologies of old age and trying to eliminate them from the body. In other words, trying to pretend that they're just like infections. Remember I showed you that table a few slides ago where column 3 was a type of disease, just like column 1, the infectious diseases. You can see immediately from this simple little picture that I'm showing you now that that's never going to work because the pathologies of old age are consequences of being alive. You can't eliminate consequences of being alive without eliminating being alive, which would rather, defeat the object, really. So, let's not do that. Let's think somewhere, let's try and have a better idea. Now, I'm not the first person to notice this. I may be saying it in a little more strident language than most people, but I want you to understand that this has actually been said before. The correct answer to the question, how can we classify ways to be sick, is shown here on this slide. If you look closely, you will see that all 4 columns are the same as on the version I showed you earlier. The only difference is the location of that big black line. And that's actually really important, because what it emphasizes is that column 3 the thing that really dominates medical problems today, the chronic progressive diseases of old age, is actually nothing like column 1. It's not a disease. It's not a chunk of diseases. It's actually a chunk of bits of aging. The only difference between column 3 and column 4 is semantic. Column 3 consists of the bits of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to. And column 4 is the ones that we haven't. And that is all. If we remember that, then what we get is this. We get the motivation to work upstream. And as I said, I'm not the first person to say this. The field of gerontology has existed for a long time. In fact, for more than 100 years. Because a few people have been realizing that actually what we need to do is not try to eliminate the pathologies of old age as if they were infections. However, it turns out that the gerontology approach is also completely a non-starter for a completely different reason. The gerontology approach consists of trying to clean up our metabolism, to slow down the rate at which it generates damage. And if we could do that, great. That means we would extend the age before the damage accumulates to the point that's bad for you. But unfortunately, the only reason why this idea makes sense is because in nature, in the living world, we see a wide variation in the rates of aging. And so, the idea is you might be able in some way to understand where that variation comes from, and maybe you'd be able to use that understanding to get some kind of therapeutic ideas, some kind of way to develop medicine that would make our aging slower than it normally is. Turns out that doesn't happen. We have made no progress with the gerontology approach either. And this is why. Metabolism is really, really, really complicated. This, what I'm showing you here, is a simplified diagram, right, of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. And, it's a bit of a mess, really. Raise your hand if you write software. Right, lots of you. Okay, right. So you immediately see that this is the ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code, right? There is no way in hell that we are ever going to be able to tweak this system so as to stop it from doing the thing we don't want it to do, the creation of damage, without, at the same time, stopping it from doing things that we need it to do, having unintended consequences. It's just not going to happen. So, that's really why the gerontology approach has failed. But luckily, that's not the end of my story, because there's a third option. What I've done here in this little diagram that I've been showing you these various versions of, is I've been showing you that the thing we want to break, namely the process that leads from metabolism to pathology, from being alive to being dead, is composed of two processes, namely metabolism creating damage and damage creating pathology. And the geriatrics and gerontology approaches attack that problem by attacking one or other of those components. In geriatric medicine, we try to break the process on the right, and in gerontology, we try to break the process on the left. But there is this third option, the maintenance approach, which says let's not break either of those component processes. Instead, let's separate them from each other. What the maintenance approach consists of is just repair. It's going in and eliminating damage. Not necessarily all the damage, just some of the damage, every so often, so that even though the damage is still being created, it doesn't actually become pathogenic. And of course, what that means is that we don't need to understand the beginning and end of the process. If we can repair the damage reasonably well, reasonably often, then we can let metabolism generate that damage at the natural rate. We don't have to slow it down. We don't have to clean up metabolism, which means we don't have to understand metabolism. Fabulous. Plus also, at the other end, if we really wanted to understand, if we needed to understand how damage translates into ill health, into pathology, we'd have a lot of work to do. But the idea here is that we don't let the damage reach the level of abundance that is characteristic of late life. In other words, the damage, the level that causes pathology. We don't let that happen in the first place, so we don't need to understand why or what would happen if we did let it get to that level. It's a case of sidestepping our ignorance of these things, and it's really, really powerful. And the best of it is, if we go back to what I said about aging being a phenomenon of physics, this is something that we already successfully do. This is, of course, a car that's a very old car. It's more than 100 years old. And it didn't get that way by being built to last 100 years. It got that way by being built to last maybe 10 or 15 years, and then, amazingly, its owners fell in love with it, and they decided to do an unusually comprehensive amount of preventative maintenance on it. And here it is, it's working just as well. Preventative maintenance, it just works, just so long as it's sufficiently comprehensive. So, what does that actually mean? Well, at the end of the day, the fundamental thing I've told you is that we can sidestep all of our ignorance of the immense complexity of metabolism, and we can also sidestep our ignorance of the immense complexity of pathology of old age. But what we cannot sidestep is the complexity of the intermediates, of the damage itself. So what we have to do is we have to figure out how big is that complexity? How nasty is damage? And it turns out that it's not too bad. What I've got here is a classification of damage on the left-hand side of this table. You can see just 7 categories of damage, a very manageable number. And if you look at the bottom line, you may be thinking, how did Aubrey know that it's only 7 categories? Maybe there's another category and another one after that just waiting to be discovered. But it's looking pretty good, because the fact is, all these 7 were discovered at least 35 years ago. That's a very long time not to find anything else in any area of science. So it's pretty good. We're pretty confident that this is all there is. And the thing is, these categories are not just ways to describe types of aging. They also have corresponding types of repair. So if I just, for illustration, since I don't have much time, if I just talk about the first example, cell loss. What is cell loss? It's just cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. That's all it is. If that's the situation that's happening in a particular organ, obviously the number of cells in the organ is going to progressively decline, and eventually there aren't going to be enough cells for the organ to do its job. What do we do about that? We put cells back. And that, of course, is something you already know about. It's called stem cell therapy. Stem cell therapy, that's all it is, right? You program cells in the laboratory so that they're in a state where they know what to do, so that you can inject them into the body and they will simply divide and transform themselves into replacements of the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. That's all that stem cell therapy is. Now, you may ask, well, if it's that simple, why hasn't it already been done? And the answer fundamentally is the rest of the list. I have an answer for each of the 7 things. There is an entry in the right-hand side of this table and on every row. But we can't do them yet, or at least not well enough. And the reason why Sense Research Foundation exists, this is the charity based in California that has been created around this idea, the reason we exist is because we need to bring in money in order to do early-stage research to actually get these things far enough along that we can actually use them. It's working out very nicely, but it's taking time. The good news, the first piece of good news, is that at least it's now a mainstream idea. When I first proposed this maintenance approach back in the year 2000, 17, 18 years ago, I received a great deal of blowback. A lot of people thought I was completely insane and that this was absolutely ridiculous. They just couldn't see how it would work. But over the years, that's changed. Basically, as people have understood the science that I was basing this concept on, it's become much more mainstream. What I'm just showing here is our scientific advisory board, which is a bunch of extremely world-leading scientists from very prestigious institutions, people who are pursuing all of this work and who have definitely very strongly and publicly endorsed it. What's perhaps more important is that it's being reinvented. This idea is now, other people are coming up with it and pretending it's original. So this paper here that I have mentioned, which was published 5 years ago, they basically just completely reproduced the idea. They split aging into 9 categories rather than 7, but it's the same concept, corresponding interventions. And what matters here is that this paper is being used as essentially the definition of what's worth doing in the biology of aging. It seems very likely that this paper will become the most highly cited paper this decade in the biology of aging. We've published a bunch of our own research findings that have really made huge progress in these areas, so that's very nice. But the final thing I want to say before I finish is that this is all just medicine, medical research. We're interested in keeping people healthy. Now, I get a lot of media attention for my predictions about how long people are going to live in the future. But that's not what we work on. Longevity is a side effect of health. You only live long if you're healthy. And the reason why the media tend to get so sensationalist about the longevity prospects from all of this is because people tend to be very ambivalent about longevity. They tend to think, well, is it a good thing to live longer? But the only way that you can even ask yourself that question is if you forget that longevity is a side effect of health. Because I'm fairly sure that nobody in this room wants to get Alzheimer's disease. Let's not worry about all these potential risks of problems we might create if we didn't have aging anymore. Instead, let's think about the solutions. Let's think about how great it would be if people just didn't get sick when they got old, because that's what this is all about. We don't know how soon this is going to happen. This is pioneering technology. I think we've got a 50-50 chance of getting there within 20 years. But I know perfectly well that things might turn up that would make it harder, that would make it take 100 years. Maybe there's a 10% chance of that. So what? The fact is, this is coming. And everybody's going to understand that it's coming quite soon. If you want to know more about it, read this book, which I wrote a few years ago. It's very thorough in talking about the biology of all of this. And if you really want to know more, you can ask me questions right now. Thank you.